by now we don't have a way to save our progress, and all the time that we will track, as well as all new activities we're gonna add, they will be lost after we refresh the page. So we're gonna have to do something about it. And one of the solutions that I would like to implement next is to sync the current state of our application with the local storage, so that next time when we open up this application, all the state will be restored and we can continue tracking our progress further. But before getting to integration of local storage with our application, let's switch over to the module time.js. And right here, for testing purposes, when we are assigning current date to the reactive variable now, before assigning this current date, I would like to reset amount of hours as well as amount of seconds and set these values to 0. This way, the modified date object will always correspond to the midnight of the current day. It will be just easier for us to test our application if timeline indicator will always start from the very top of the page. And also, every time we're gonna come back to the timeline page, since we start the timer to track the current time by calling this start timer function, we're going to reset the current date to the midnight by assigning newly created object date to the reactive variable. Because just a second ago, we mutated this date object to match today's midnight. And after doing all these changes, we will see the following result. First thing that we see in here is that our timeline indicator starts moving from the very top of the page, from the hour 0, and in addition to that, it will also start moving from the very first hour whenever we're gonna come back to timeline page from a different page. And now we'll get to the main part of this lesson, and that is start working on the integration of local storage. And for this, I'm going to create a separate module. Let's call this module storage.js, which responsibility will be to communicate with the local storage of the browser. So in here, we're gonna have to define two main operations. Firstly, we need to load data from the local storage to restore the state of our application. And also, we need a way to save the data back into the local storage whenever user closes the tab with our application, or he goes to another tab, which will make tab with our application inactive. And of course, we need a way to detect when tab with our application will become inactive, or when it will be completely closed. So let's switch over to the main module of our application, main.js, right before we create Vue application. So in here, I'm going to register a listener on the document object, and the event that we need to listen to in this case is called visibility change. This is a default browser event, which will basically be fired whenever current tab becomes inactive or active, or it completely closes. And to determine if the tab has become active or inactive, we can do by checking visibility state property of the document object. And if this property will be equal to hidden, that means the tab has become inactive or closed. So right before closing, we need to save the state of our application. So we'll call function save state, which we will define right here. And this function is going to communicate with our module storage in order to save the state of our application to local storage. To be able to call these two functions, load and save, from the main module of our application, we have to write down an import statement. And in here, I'm gonna group all the exported functions under the name storage, like this. So now let's decide which data we actually need to store in a local storage. Since our application works with two types of resources, timeline items and activities, therefore, we have to store both of these resources. We're going to store them in one object, let's create an object with two keys, timeline items and activities. And to both of these keys, we're gonna assign corresponding arrays of timeline items and activities. These arrays are reactive, because currently in our application we have two separate global modules which manage timeline items and activities separately. As a reminder, timeline item objects look like this. Every timeline item object corresponds to a particular hour of the day, and its structure consists of three fields: activity ID, activity seconds, and hour. And as for activities objects, every activity object is responsible for showing individual activity item on this page, and every activity item object consists of three properties: ID, name, and seconds to complete. From the code perspective, it looks like this. Let's go to timeline items module. Right here we can see a declaration of timeline items reactive array, which stores all timeline item objects. And similarly, we have the declaration of activities reactive array inside activities module. And since we need to get access to both of these arrays from main.js module, we need to import them separately. Firstly, let's import activities array from activities module and timeline items array from timeline items module. Next, we're going to implement save function from the storage module. In here, we are passing the data that we need to store inside the local storage as the first parameter. So we have to go to storage module and declare one parameter. Let's call this parameter data. And here we will reference local storage object. This is the object available in the browser by default. And in order to store the data in local storage, we use setItem method, which accepts the key as the first parameter under which we will store the data. Let's use our app name. I'm going to declare this constant in the constants module and assign the app name, which is on track. Switching back to storage.js, let's import newly created constant app name from constants module. And as a second parameter to setItem function, we have to pass the data that we like to store in local storage. So in here we need to specify the data which we have received as the first parameter in this function. Let's destructure the object with this data. And this way we'll get two destructured properties, timeline items and activities. Besides this, we also have to store another piece of data, and that is current date represented by string. We can get string representation of the current date by calling toDateString method, like so. Later it will become clear why we need this additional data in here. So let's go over all this implementation once again. Once user closes the tab with our application, the event visibility change gets fired, and then we execute the code inside this if conditional block, right before application is fully closed. And then this method references our module storage, which communicates with the local storage of the browser. And in here we're saving all the data in the local storage that we have passed from outside, that is, timeline items and activities. And just to make sure if visibility change event will be fired whenever we're gonna close the tab or refresh the page, I'm going to print something to the console right here. And indeed, whenever we're gonna refresh the page, we will notice that word hidden is printed to the console. And now let's also take a look if the state of our application was actually stored inside local storage. As we can see, here we have additional key which corresponds to our app name, which is on track, and this key stores all the state of our application. Here we can see all the data we have specified earlier, activity objects, as well as timeline item objects. But of course, if now we're going to create new activity and then refresh the page, we will see that the newly created activity is gone, and that is because currently we're not loading the data from local storage, but only saving it. So in the next lesson, we're gonna get to the second part of this functionality, which is loading the data from the local storage when our application starts. The link to the source code of this application will be in the video description.